Thank you very much for this opportunity and for listening this late in the day. I've really learned a lot actually from all of the speakers today. So I'm Danielle Gaucher. I'm a professor of psychology at the University of Manitoba. And today I'm going to be telling you about some of the evidence-based insights for promoting positive attitudes and intergroup relations. So first I wanted to start just by telling you a little bit about how I've approached this topic. So I'm trained as a social psychologist, and this means that I attempt to understand people's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors from a person by situation framework. So we tend to look at how characteristics of the individual, but also the social context, how those affect people's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, but also the interaction between characteristics of the individual and the social context, and how those can affect people's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And I've studied many issues related to social inequality over the years and social change, and have really been focusing on immigration-related work since joining P2P in 2014. Okay, so how do we see the role of attitudes in migration? Well, in a relatively recent social issues and policy review paper, we had argued that public attitudes can influence migration at multiple points. So public attitudes can affect the immigration policies within a nation, influencing things like entry numbers, the stringency and punitive nature of policies, but also the type of and kind of supports that are offered to new arrivals. Public attitudes also just more generally affect the warmth of the welcome, affecting things like the expression of prejudice and just intergroup harmony more generally. We also know that these attitudes towards migration can vary greatly in their positivity. Right? So this variability can be seen both at the country level, so average attitudes among Canadians versus Americans, for example, but also within countries, so attitudes among people living in urban versus rural centers or communities. And attitudes can also vary in positivity even within individuals themselves, depending on what's happening in the social environment and the individual's construal or perceptions of those events. So we know there's a lot of variability in attitudes, and that these can be expressed differently at the country, region, or even individual level. So what are the factors then that actually influence these attitudes? And so what we did a couple years back is we looked to the literature to find out what the antecedents of migration-related attitudes are. Okay, and so here's the working model that we came up with, and I say working because with these models, we're always updating them depending on new studies that come out or are added to the literature reviews. So there's a couple of important things here that I'd like to share. So the first you'll notice is that there's a number of different factors that influence the public's attitudes towards migration and immigrants. One of the things to note is that the literature, there's no one factor that comes out as the most important factor. In fact, that's partly because within the literature at least, very rarely will researchers be able to assess all of the different factors at one time to come up with which factor is the most important. So rarely are there comparisons then about which factor plays the largest role. Also, typically, and you may notice this just from the slide here, is that most of the, at least social psychological literature, is focused on understanding citizens or host community members' attitudes towards migration. There's much less empirical work that's been done on the other side of the coin, looking at immigrants' attitudes towards members of the host culture. Okay, if I had a pointer, I'd point to the bottom box there. Oh, I do. Oh, yeah? Oh, right there. All right. Thank you. Okay. And when there is social psychological work that has been done down here, most often that work has focused on looking at immigrants' acculturation attitudes. So that's their orientation towards how they will engage with members of the host community and whether they prefer strategies of assimilation or integration, for example. Okay. So one thing, though, that is clear from the literature is that there is a large body of work showing that perceived threat leads to anti-immigrant sentiment or less positive attitudes. And this may not come as a surprise for many of you here. So much of the literature discusses the important role of what has been termed realistic threats. So these are perceiving immigrants as a threat to the host community's economic or political power, or symbolic threats, believing one's values or beliefs are threatened, or that the Canadian way of life is somehow threatened by new arrivals. Okay. There's other sources of threat that can arise from threats to the host nation's safety in the form of a terrorist threat, crime, disease, and from threats arriving from the perceived size of the migrant population. Okay. So a few interesting things here to note. Most of the earlier models had focused on threat almost exclusively, so, showing evidence for the fact that greater perceptions of threat, whether it be what they call perceived realistic. Oh, I can't go back. Can I go back? There we go. Whether they be threats from realistic symbolic safety or size, that more threat was associated with less positive attitudes. But newer models had proposed that people in the host community engage in a more cost-benefit type of analysis. So if threats on average loom larger than the perceived benefits, then you may see relatively more negative public attitudes. And then on the other side of the coin, however, if the perceived benefits loom larger than perceived threats, then you would predict that public attitudes should become more positive. Okay. Also, there's another couple little points I'd like to make here. It turns out that there's relatively less or little evidence that actual unemployment rates or economic scarcity predict anti-immigrant attitudes. Generally, it's more about the perception of economic threat. And in terms of size, some research has suggested that it's more about the rate of arrival than the absolute numbers or size of the group. Okay. So as a social psychologist, then, we also do pay attention to individual differences and how these can affect attitudes. So in terms of individual differences and other types of ideological factors, of the big 5 personality traits, that's what we refer to them as, some research has found that people who are more agreeable and who are more open to experience, to the extent that people are more agreeable and open to experience, the more positive their attitudes are towards immigrants and immigration. Also, those who are higher in what's called right-wing authoritarianism, these are people who have a tendency to adhere to traditional societal norms. These people tend to obey authority figures, show willingness to participate in authority-sanctioned aggression towards groups, and that people who are high in social dominance orientation, these are people who believe that group-based hierarchy is somewhat inevitable and that some groups simply deserve to be at the top and others at the bottom. So that those people who score higher in social dominance and right-wing authoritarianism often show or tend to show more negative attitudes. Okay? In the literature, however, it's also important to note that these individual differences were often discussed in relation to theories of immigration that focused on perceived threat and competition. So, people who are high in social dominance orientation, for example, likely perceive greater threat, thus reporting less favorable attitudes. Okay, so that's just a very, very short snapshot of the literature. We had 15 minutes and thousands of papers. So I hope you were able to take something from that. But then we come to this very important question then, which is how can we foster more positive intergroup attitudes? And I'm very, very interested to hear about what has worked for your organizations. And I think we'll have some time to talk about that at the end. But here are just some insights from the social psychological literature. Okay, so I talked a lot about the role of threat. To foster positive intergroup relations, reducing threat, or at least not triggering threat, is one important avenue. So you may be thinking, okay, well, how do I do this? And I think there are a number of very simple things that can be done. One of them involves reflecting on the language that's used to discuss immigration-related attitudes, or issues, rather. Especially the language that's used in widely circulated media that reaches a large number of people, so thus has a very potentially big effect or consequence. So using inflammatory wording, like referring to groups of people as flooding the border, or explosion of numbers, or referring to some cultural practices as, quote, barbaric, likely leads to greater threat and less positive attitudes. But the absence of threat, some will argue, is simply neutrality, or maybe even indifference. So to move attitudes towards the positive, I think it's also smart to simultaneously focus on the benefits of immigration and highlight the stories of resilience, but focusing both on social and economic benefits. Sorry, I realize that I'm not going down sequentially in my list. This is the number, I'm on point 3 here. So some sources of threat, especially threat that's centering on the size and safety of threats, they may be quelled by enhancing the public's feelings of control. So we know from the literature and from studies that have been conducted that it's very psychologically uncomfortable for people to believe that things in the world are happening randomly or haphazardly. And so even if people feel like they don't have personal control over the migration that's happening in their cities or towns, forms of secondary control may be an avenue to help them to cope with the change. So important systems and organizations like settlement agencies and LIPS, they can help people to feel like things are under control, even if they themselves, members of the public, don't have that sense of personal control. Also, when I talk about the literature, people often ask about the role of racism or prejudice in the model. So there's a lot of really great work that's been done, empirical work demonstrating that intergroup contact, and this is a theme that's come up many times throughout the day, specifically friendship formation is definitely an empirically based way to reduce prejudice. But it needs to be the right type of contact to reduce and not inflame intergroup tensions. So a few of the important conditions for intergroup contact to work is that people come together in equal status, which sounds easier maybe than it is, equal status and common goal. Okay. Other work, I have 30 seconds, but other work has demonstrated the power of social norms in affecting people's attitudes. So we know that in the public sphere, what people deem or think to be normative will greatly influence their thoughts and their behaviors. So for example, and this is another theme that's been brought up a few times today, when system-sanctioned leaders, when they endorse multiculturalism and are pro-immigration, research has shown that this is also reflected in more pro-social attitudes that are expressed in public. So this is very important. Okay, so that's just an example of an explicit way that a social norm could be conveyed. But there's, as social psychologists, we spend a lot of time also researching the more subtle ways that social norms may be conveyed in the environment to affect people's attitudes and thoughts and behaviors. Okay, so on that note, then, I think we're ready to open it up for questions. That's all I had. So thank you.